Matthew 26, as we continue our series that we've called The Last 24. The last 24 hours of Jesus' life, we were walking through kind of stage by stage of what he experienced in those last hours of his life, obviously before his resurrection. Let me ask you this morning. Have you ever been unfairly accused of something? Have you ever had someone say something about you that wasn't true? Have you ever had someone deliberately lie about you? Anybody like that? You've had this happen? I know I have. And frankly, my first reaction is to say, it's just not fair. How could that be? I remember growing up, my nephew and I grew up together, practically like brothers. He's 6 weeks older than I am. And one of the things I loved to do when we would get in trouble is, because I was quick with words, is I would get him in trouble first. And so we would get caught or something, and I would weasel my way out as much as I could, and I would unfairly pour it onto him. And he's still holding that against me, I think, a bit. Right? But our first reactions is, this isn't fair. Like, it's instinct in us that we pride ourselves on life being fair, on fairness, on things happening in certain ways, in fairness, in just. We hate injustice. We hate to see things go against the way they should be, and especially when it has to do with us. Now, granted, we want fairness until it's we who've done it. And then we want injustice to happen. We want to slide by. We want mercy, right? When we're involved in it, when we're the ones caught, we like mercy and grace. But we live in a world where we scream for fairness. I remember hearing the story about a gentleman who was pulled over by a police officer for speeding. And he was pulled over, and the police officer came to his side window and said, if I could see your license and registration, please. And the gentleman very quickly said, I actually don't have a license. It was revoked. And I don't think I have a registration because this car is stolen. And then he said, but I could check in the glove compartment, but I want you to know I just put my gun there because I had just robbed a bank this morning, and just please don't look in the trunk. And so immediately, of course, and you know, we have police officers that come to our church. You know immediately that the police officer's got his hand on his gun. He's backing away a bit. And it was a bit of fear here to realize that this is a man who does have his license, has a stolen car, just admitted to having a gun in his glove compartment, and just robbed a bank that morning. And so immediately the police officer grabs his gun and talks to him in his walkie-talkie, and he back up here, and he back up, tells him the road. And within moments, police cars are surrounding this guy, and the captain comes out and walks up to the window and says, with guns drawn at the face of this man, says, "Sir, I need to see some ID." And immediately the man pulls out his wallet, takes out his driver's license, and hands it to the captain. The captain takes it and says, I need you to slowly open your glove compartment, please. And the man opens his glove compartment, and inside are nothing but napkins and a registration to the car. At this point, the captain's a bit confused. This man claimed to not have a license, claimed the car was stolen, and he claimed to have a gun in the glove compartment. So he decided one more move. He said, I want you to open your trunk for me. And he had some officers back in the trunk area. So they opened the trunk, and inside the trunk was absolutely nothing. No bags of cash, nothing. So slowly the captain, confused, puts his gun back down and says, "Sir, I thought you told the officer." And the guy goes, "Yeah, sir, I bet you heard the story that I had no license because it was revoked. You heard the story that I was driving a stolen car, and you heard a story that I had a gun in the glove compartment and just robbed a bank. You probably heard the story I was speeding too." Some of you get that later. Right? We love justice. We want to see justice played out. And by the way, in the first century, so did the Romans, so did the Jews. They loved fairness. They loved justice. In fact, their justice system is where we have built our justice system from, is this idea of the Roman rule of law. We use that even in our day, as we're going to see this morning. Here we are in Matthew chapter 26, and we have found over the last few weeks that these religious rulers at the beginning of the week before Jesus went to the cross, as he was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and a colt, proclaiming to be a king, crying out Hosanna toward him, that they sought to kill him. At that point, they didn't have a way to kill him. It was Passover, and everybody was gathered in the city of Jerusalem. And so there was no specific way with everybody around to take this deal and take him down. And so what they did is they had a volunteer come into their midst. The scripture says to us, as we looked at a few weeks ago, that Judas shows up in their midst and says, listen, I know how to hand him over to you. And they made a deal for 30 pieces of silver, what would be considered a pretty significant wage at one moment. Probably what some would believe is the amount of money a slave would make in their entire lifetime. And then Judas takes that money and begins to plan out how this is going to go down. We looked then they were in the upper room, and Jesus obviously predicted this. They headed out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and while there, he's praying 3 times, Father, not my will, but yours be done. And we find then Judas shows up, as we looked at last week. Judas shows up, and we looked at the contrast between Judas and Peter, who denies Jesus. But Judas shows up and betrays him with a kiss. And it says in the scriptures that he brought an entire unit with him, the chief priests and a unit of soldiers, a form of soldiers that would come with him. Scholars believe that was up to 600 soldiers. In fact, the name captain written in the Gospel of Luke actually means the name captain is leader of 1,000. So up to 600 to 1,000 soldiers came to arrest Jesus. They so badly wanted to get rid of him that they came into the garden in the middle of the night at midnight with up to 1,000 soldiers. Why? Because maybe they were afraid that Jesus would run, but we know the story. Jesus didn't run. In fact, he went with them. In a last moment, he shows compassion on the servant's ear that was cut off by Peter, and then they take him and arrest him. We find in that moment him deserted by all of his followers. All of his disciples who followed him had deserted him. Peter, the only one who follows him, ends up denying him 3 times. He's left alone, now under arrest, now in control of the state. And that's where we want to pick up the story. Taken captive, betrayed by a friend, arrested by his own. And yet in this we see God's divine plan. Now, I want you to consider this for a moment. Could the human rejection of Jesus get any worse than this moment? I want you to consider that this morning. I mean, we're not just talking about some Roman guy showing up and arresting what they thought were a criminal. We're talking about the chief priest. We're talking about the high priest of the temple. We're talking about the religious leaders of the people of God. I mean, these were the men who were employed under God to lead people in worship of God and teach them the Holy Scriptures. These were the ones that actually oversaw all the dedication of sacrifices that were happening during Passover week in the temple. These weren't just some normal guys. These were the ones who were the spiritual leaders of the people of Israel. And yet they were rejecting and desiring the downfall of Jesus. That's right, Jesus, the one who the angels sang at his birth. Consider that this morning. You can't get any worse than human rejection than not only your own, but the ones who are in charge of the system that God set up, rejecting you. And here we find then the trials of Jesus. He's arrested, and then he's led before these trials. Now, what I want to do this morning, because I believe probably most of us have probably never gazed at these trials of Jesus. We want to walk through this morning these different trials that he's faced. Clearly, in their mind, he had disturbed the peace, he had caused division, and Jesus was looked at as destructive according to their image of him. They wanted to get rid of him. And what we're going to find here is that Jesus actually has a criminal record based upon these trials. Now let's describe, before we dive into the text, a little bit of background. There are going to be actually 2 sets of trials with 3 different hearings. There are not just one trial that happens, Jesus goes to the cross. There are actually 6 different hearings spread over 2 types of trials. First of all, there are the religious trials. And the religious trials are by the Jewish leaders. And the question that they're going to ask is this: are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ, the Greek word for Messiah? Are you the anointed one? Are you God? They then lead him to the civil trial. The civil trial is under the Roman government, and it is under, as we see, Pontius Pilate, Herod, and Pontius Pilate. And the question that is asked, because clearly to them, they don't care if somebody claims to be God. They don't care if somebody claims to be the Messiah. What the Roman Empire cared about was, are you claiming to be a king? Because in their world, the king was only one, and that was Caesar. And so, of course, to get death as well, they had to take him to the civil trial, to the Roman leaders. The Jews could not put anyone to death under their authority. And so we see two sets of trials. And what I want to do this morning is kind of walk through this 5 hours of time frame where Jesus was tried by these leaders. Now, before we go any further, let me describe to you some rules that were absolutely true in the first century. Now, by the way, you and I, our system is set up in the same exact way. There are 3 different rules that overarch everything else in the first century law system. First of all, the trials had to be public. They had to be public trials. This is true, by the way, today. You and I can go down to Washington, D.C. and go into the Supreme Court building and actually watch the cases take place. You can go any day of the week over to the district courthouse here in Hagerstown, and you can walk in and watch a trial take place. Now, there are certain occasions where that's not the case, but almost every trial is public. It had to be public. What we're going to find with Jesus is that they actually take him not to the normal place they take criminals. In fact, they take Jesus to the house of the high priest. Very different. Usually there's a place called the Hall of Judgment. They don't take him there. They take him to the house of the high priest. And it's in the middle of the night, mind you. We're talking about 1 to 2 a.m. now. So clearly, these trials are not public. They're actually in the darkness of night. Secondly, the rule was, this is true in the Jews and the Romans, and true today, there had to be solid evidence of at least 2 witnesses. There had to be at least 2 witnesses that saw and witnessed what this person had done. By the way, you see this when Jesus talks about church discipline. It says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. That came from this idea of witnesses, having witnesses of someone in sin. And so this picture of having 2 witnesses was their custom of the day. One person couldn't just come and accuse the other person of something. It's just he said, she said. But when you have 2, it brings legitimacy to the accusation. And so there had to be 2 witnesses. And by the way, these witnesses had to be sequestered. In other words, they didn't allow them to go talk to each other. And that's true, by the way, even today. If you are a witness in a court case, you're asked not to talk to other witnesses. This is a similar law that we have today. And the third law that was true then and is true today is that there had to be the right of defense. That if you were being accused, you had a right then to defend themselves. Now, in the first century, you weren't innocent until proven guilty. You were actually guilty until proven innocent. However, you had the right to fairly defend yourself. There were justices and there were advocates and lawyers who were be hired and could go in and make the case for you. So they understood the same system that you and I have was very similar to the system that they had. And they were supposed to have a defense. When an accusation made, they could defend themselves. Now, what we're going to find with Jesus is this does not happen, that all of these things don't take place. In fact, it's actually the adverse side. This is a kangaroo court, and it not only does not justice take place, we see a great injustice takes place. And let's walk through this. We're gonna get to Matthew 26, but we're going to first start in John where this happened. In fact, we find that Jesus is first led to Annas. And we read in John chapter 18 about Annas. Now, before we dive in, let me give you some background here, and we're going to kind of look over these things pretty quickly. Annas was a pretty old guy. Annas was one of 2 high priests. Let me explain. This is one of the only times, very few times in Israel's history have there been 2 high priests. The reason for that, and this was unique, is because Annas was a pretty shrewd guy. He's a shrewd character. He had served as high priest, and the rule is, according to the Old Testament, that if you were selected to be the high priest, obviously a high priest under the tribe of Levi in the line of Aaron, if you were selected to be the high priest, you served for life. It was like a Supreme Court justice. Once you're in, you're in. You're in for life. Well, Annas was so shrewd. Historians write about Annas that Annas actually was responsible for what, remember when Jesus went to the temple and threw out the money changers? They were actually called the bazaars of Annas. Annas made the temple a farmer's market. Annas was controlling everything behind the scenes. And because he was so evil, they asked him to step down, but they couldn't actually ask him to step down because once you're a high priest, you're a high priest for life. So what he did is they had a co-reign as high priest. And what he did is he had his sons reign, but they didn't do very well either. And so eventually his son-in-law, and his son-in-law was named Caiaphas, is going to reign. So they're actually reigning together as high priests. It's one of the only times in history that happened. And it's during Jesus' day. And so they led Jesus to Annas out of respect because he was the elder high priest. And I would dare say Annas was actually kind of like the mafia boss. He was behind the scenes playing the game. He was playing the political game, and he had control over his son-in-law. Obviously, if you have in-laws, you know what I'm talking about. In-laws can be outlaws at times. Some of you didn't say amen to that. That's good. His son-in-law, he kind of puppeteered him, right? He oversaw him. And so here's Annas behind the scenes, and he's, I just picture him in the corner going, listen, I know a guy in his Italian accent. I can take you out, man. That's Annas here, okay? Annas has controlled this. Now, Jesus comes before him, and Annas is an older man, and Jesus responds. He says, hey, are you proclaiming that you're the Christ? And Jesus says this, John 18, verse 20, I have spoken openly to you. I've always taught in synagogues and in temple where all the Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. No, you know what Jesus says? Jesus appeals to the system. Jesus says, listen, why are you asking me in private? You've known what I've said in public. You don't have to question me what I've said. I've made it known, everything that I've said. And he's actually playing a little part here in describing the justice system of their day. And he said, hey, we're having a secret meeting. It's not a public trial. You know what I've said. I've said it out in public. I haven't hidden it. In fact, he goes on and he says, why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me. Go talk to the ones who've heard me. And when he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand. Now, this was not allowed. The prisoner couldn't be touched. He could only be arrested, but he couldn't be beat upon yet because there had been no verdict given. But this man punches him and says, is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? And then Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So he comes to Annas out of respect first. They take him to Annas. Annas questions him, and Jesus says, listen, you're questioning me in private. You've heard what I've said in public. And then they strike him, and he says, well, why do you strike me? Bring a witness against me. Jesus here is appealing to the system and saying, do you have any witnesses against me? Do you have anybody that can proclaim that I did something wrong? And he leads him to Caiaphas, the high priest. This is Annas' son-in-law. Now, I want to describe to you a bit about Caiaphas. Today, you can go to Jerusalem and you can see the house of Caiaphas. In fact, I want to show you a couple pictures, pretty interesting. These are the actual steps leading into Caiaphas' home. You can go there today. These are actually the steps of Jesus' day. This is the steps he would have walked. And if you walk up those steps, there is a layout of Caiaphas' home. You can go there today and walk them. These are the first century steps. It's pretty awesome. And it goes up into this home area that would have been a courtyard. Now, this is a picture of what it would have looked like. This is a model represented of what the courtyard would have looked like. By the way, this is the same courtyard that Peter ends up denying Jesus in. How this probably would have looked is because they were both high priests and they were in-laws, is Annas would have probably lived on one side of the courtyard and Caiaphas on the other. So when they took Jesus, they took him from Annas and they just went back over to the house of Caiaphas, who was the serving, acting high priest. If Annas was the high priest emeritus, Caiaphas was the actual acting high priest. And so they would have walked him across the courtyard. While they were waiting for all of this exchange, they would have put Jesus, and this is found under the ruins of Caiaphas' house, are these jail cells. Take a look at these. Pretty interesting. These are, you can go and walk through those today. These are actually under the house of Caiaphas. And this is where they would have held criminals in that day waiting to be seen by the high priest. And so they would have held him there. The only way in these is pretty interesting. The only way in this section is, and now you can get in, you can walk in there because they've opened it up, but the only way to get in there was actually through a little hole. Take a look at this. This was the only way, the doorway into the jail cells. What they would do is they would tie your hands like this, and they would lower you through this hole. And they would keep your hands tied until they wanted to pull you out, and then they pulled you out. This is the way they made sure criminals couldn't escape. There was no way out of this. If there was a fire, you're dead. If somebody covered the hole, it was over. So this was the way they dealt with criminals. So Jesus, most likely, while he was waiting, was put into one of these jail cells, and he was lowered into one of these holes until Caiaphas woke up or whatever. And this happened over a period of hours. He would have gone back and forth, and this is what it would have looked like for him. So he goes before Caiaphas. Caiaphas had been a priest for nearly 20 years. And we find here in Matthew 26 the interrogation of Jesus. Take a look at it, verse 57. It says, "Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered." Now we're going to talk about this group in a moment. These were probably about 23 men. Later on, we're going to see he leads them before the entire council, which would be about 71 men. These were called the Sanhedrin. We're going to talk about those in a moment. Verse 59. "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, 'This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Now, you know Jesus said a similar statement. He said, "I'm able to destroy this temple and in 3 days rise it again." But they took that and made it talk about the temple of God. And so these aren't even true. These are false witnesses. And Matthew is telling us, no, they're false. And in fact, what we find in the Gospel of Luke is that they don't even agree. The false witnesses don't agree with each other, so they don't really come together in their story. Now notice what happens. They found none. And the last 2 came forward and said this, verse 62, "And the high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? Is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.'" So he says, "I put you under a curse before God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so, but I tell you from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need?" Now mind you, they haven't had any. "What else do we need? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then, now notice here again, illegal, they spit in his face and they strike him, and some slapped him, and they said, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that struck you?" So here he is, probably blindfolded, and they say, "Crucify him." They begin to punch him, and they say, who was it that punched you? Tell us if you're the Messiah, if you're this great prophet, if you're really who you say you are. Do this. Now, granted, this is all illegal. This is all illegal, but they do this. Then take him before the rest of the council. Here we see Caiaphas. At this point, it's probably about 2:30, 3 in the morning. I don't know about you, but I like my sleep. And I can just imagine, you can imagine the physical exhaustion now, the emotional exhaustion that Jesus felt as a human being, right? He was fully human. Let's not forget that. This is written to remind us of that. I mean, here he was up all night. Now, I don't know about you. I remember when I was younger, I could stay up most of the night and be okay. And then you'd sleep all day, but you could be up, right? I don't know if some of you, and I'm at this point in my life where I need a certain amount of sleep. I need that, right? And it's not a good thing if I don't have that. And I can imagine Jesus exhausted. I mean, this is going on all night, the turmoil of this night. By the way, I think it's funny as people get older, they always think, I don't need as much sleep as I used to. And here's what happens. By 2 p.m., you're like this. I only need 4 hours of sleep a night. Yeah, but you're sleeping at 2 p.m. because you can't stay awake, right? And so I kind of kid around with my father-in-law about that. And he always says, man, he prides himself on getting up really early in the morning. I say, yeah, but you're done by 2 p.m. That's the problem. Notice then they take him before the chief priests. Notice chapter 27, verse 1. They take him before what is called the Sanhedrin. This is the third section of this trial. It says, and when morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. Notice they all gathered together. This is the Sanhedrin. Let me explain the Sanhedrin for a moment. The Sanhedrin were actually 23 men, and in major court cases, it was actually 71 men. This is found in Numbers chapter 11. These were the most wisest and pious men in Israel of the day. The Sanhedrin was kind of like our present-day Supreme Court. They function in making decisions on the worst cases imaginable. Only the most serious of crimes would come before them. And here they are meeting with Jesus. By the way, notice the beginning of chapter 27. It says, when morning had come. So here now, this stuff had happened all night, and now morning had come. The rest of the Sanhedrin were able to gather together. And the rule was in the Sanhedrin that each of them had to vote on what they wanted to do. They don't vote here. In fact, it just says they all agree. However that happened, they all agree he needs to be put to death. They all agree to his death. And they bind him and now lead him. They could not put anyone to death, but they all agreed he had to be put to death. Then we come across to the civil trial. They lead him, it says in chapter 27, verse 2, they bind him and lead him to Pilate. Now, we're not going to have time to dig into all of these things, but they lead him to Pilate. Pilate was the Roman governor, and he was a Roman governor of the area of Judea. Let me explain a little bit about what's happening here. Our system is very much like that system there. It's very similar, almost eerily. In their day, what they would do is section off the Roman Empire, much like we have states here in the USA. And over top of those areas, they would put governors. They would lead. In fact, they were even called kings. You found, for example, King Herod. We call him a king, but he really wasn't a king. Caesar was the king. He was actually a governor, but they would lead them kind of like they were kings. And so Pilate was given authority over the area of Judea. Now, Pilate had been in trouble. We know that historians have talked about that. And so he was over Judea. He had some bad political spells happening, and he was over the area of Judea. Now, when he was in Jerusalem, he was there with intention because it was Passover. He was there to watch the celebration take place of the people that he oversaw. The place he stayed while in Jerusalem was actually called the Antonio Palace. Let me show you this. It's pretty interesting. It was both a governor's mansion and a military fortress. This is a model of that. This is where it would have been and what it would have looked like in Jerusalem. It's about a quarter of a mile away from Caiaphas' house. Pilate, by the way, most of the time stayed at a lake home on the ocean side. That's what governors do, right? Pilate, though, was in Jerusalem, so he stayed here at the Antonio Fortress. And you can go there today and see the ruins of this place. It's a pretty awesome place. So he comes before Pilate. Take a look at verse 11, 27, verse 11. Now, if you want more information, go to John 18, which gives you the entire dialogue between Jesus and Pilate. It's pretty amazing, pretty astounding. But here's what happens. It says, and Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Now remember, this is a civil trial, and what matters to them is not is Jesus the Messiah, because that doesn't matter. Does he claim to be a king? Now we got an issue. And what we find is that Pilate follows the Roman rules. Exactly. The Roman rules were 4 different types of things in the court system. First of all, there was the accusation. The accusation would be brought to Pilate. He would then ask the question. The second part would be interrogation. So they came to him. John tells us they brought Jesus to him, and they said, this man claims to be a king. They don't say he claims to be a Messiah because they wouldn't care about that. This man claims to be king over Caesar. So he interrogates him. Jesus, do you claim to be the king? Are you the king of the Jews? Now, of course, the king of the Jews in their mind was Caesar. He was the king over everything. Notice the response. Jesus said, you have said so. But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. So he asks, he interrogates, and then the third part of the Roman rule is defense. Jesus defends himself. You have said it. I'm the king of the Jews. That's what you've said. And then he declares a verdict. In John 18, he goes out before them and he says, I find this man not guilty. But Pilate was in a predicament. He was in a predicament because of the political system of the day, and he was about ready to be in trouble. And so he knew that if a insurgents rose up, he would be in a dire situation. And so he hears that Jesus is a Galilean, and he sends him to Herod. Herod was the governor of Galilee, where Jesus was originally from. And so he sends him to Herod. We're not going to read that for the sake of time, but in John 18, he goes before Herod. Herod has this great party and says, hey, I've been waiting to meet you. Herod was a jokester. Herod, by the way, this is a different Herod than when Jesus was born. However, it was the same offspring of Herod when Jesus was born. And Herod ends up in the end, if you read John 18, a powerful statement. He sends him back to Pilate and says, I don't think he's guilty either. I think he's just crazy. I think he's just a little loco. That's all I think about this man. I don't think there's anything wrong with him. He's a king. Come on. He's bound in chains. How kingly can you get? And Herod sends him back to Pilate and says, you do whatever you want with him. I give you permission. So Pilate comes back to the chief priests and says, we find no fault in this man. Now, what happens, because of the rising of the crowd, because of the way the crowd is now conspiring against Pilate, notice what happens. We read this story. And again, we're going to highlight it just for a moment. But it says, verse 15, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. This was a custom they would do every year during Passover. And they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said, whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ, the Messiah? For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, saying, have nothing to do with this righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. So his wife is even saying, listen, don't mess with this guy. Let him go. Now the chief priests and elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And the governor again said to them, which of the two do you want me to release of you? And they said, surprisingly to Pilate, if you read John, they said Barabbas. Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? And they all said, let him be crucified. And he said, why? What evil has he done? And they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. Pilate here is trying to make a deal. We're about 6 a.m., 7 a.m. in the morning. The crowds are gathering around. It's now Passover. Celebration has happened the night before. People are having an exuberant time with their families. And here they show up, and the chief priests are paying people off, saying, hey, when he asks you this question, you better say Barabbas. Now, I find the interaction here telling, and I want to highlight this for a moment because I think this is astounding. The name Barabbas means son of the Father. Bara Abbas. Bar means son. Abbas, Abba, means father, daddy. Here we have the Son of God, the true Son of God, being put to death. And here we have one called the Son of the Father, who is being released. What we know about Barabbas is probably he was a zealot who wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire. He was probably had murdered multiple people. The guy didn't deserve anything but death. And yet here we have the Son of God taking the place of the Son of the Father. I wonder if his name meant something different to him after this. Now I know as we look at this, we see this take place. We see a great injustice. I want to read to you what one expert says, and then I want to talk about this for a moment as we close. It says, the trial of Jesus Christ represents the darkest day in the history of jurisprudence. The man that was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death was the only perfect and completely innocent person who ever lived. Yet he was declared guilty of crimes he never committed. Then he was sentenced to the most painful form of capital punishment ever devised. Now let's stop right there for a moment. While part of his statement, that writer's statement, is true, right? The injustice that Jesus received is very clear as you read this text. But can we be honest for a moment? Was Jesus innocent of the claims they were making? Like the two questions, are you the Son of God? Are you the Christ? Was he innocent of that, or was he guilty of that? He was guilty of that, was he not? I mean, he was claiming to be God, was he not? I mean, in their mind, it was blasphemous, but he was guilty of the crime that they were committing to him. I mean, they weren't charging him with murder or robbery or hatred. They were charging him with calling himself God. Secondly, before Pilate, did he not claim to be the King of the Jews? Jesus not only claimed to be the King of the Jews, he claimed to be King of kings and Lord of lords. Jesus was absolutely guilty on the charges they made against him. Now the question is, did it deserve death? You and I can clearly see it didn't, but that God had another plan. I want to go back for a moment, and I want to highlight just a text that stands out to me that I never had realized before. And one author calls this the great reversal, and this just astounded me. Take a look, go back to chapter 26, and take a look at verse 63. The question that they ask in verse 62 is are you the Christ? Tell us, verse 63, are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? Have you no answer to make? Are you the one you're claiming to be? Are you God? Notice Jesus' response. It says, Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man. Now stop right here for a moment. You know what Jesus just proclaimed to them? He says, listen, you are going to, from now on, see the Son of Man. Now, wait a minute. They're getting ready to put him to death. They know it's headed there. They know they're going to make this deal because Pilate's in trouble. They know they can persuade him to put him to death, so they know he's going to die. And he says, no, you're going to see me. You're not, this isn't over yet. You will see the Son of Man. You know what Jesus just says? By the way, the title that he gives himself here is the answer to the question of the Son of God, because whenever they ask, are you the Son of God, he always says, I'm the Son of Man. What he was portraying was that he was God. He was both man and God, his divinity and his deity. And I can probably, if we had time, show you how that's true, how that's an understanding that even they had that he was saying. So he says to them, listen, I'm exactly who you claim to be. I am the Son of Man. I'm exactly, and guess what? You're going to see it. Here you are blind, but you're going to see I am the Son of Man. Now watch, he goes on. I am the Son of Man. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. It's interesting because in their day, criminals stood for the entire case. It's somewhat true in our day. When you're being tried, right, what do? All rise. And the judge does what? Where does the judge go? The judge goes up to the bench and sits down on a seat. The criminal actually stands. So in our day, we have lawyers who stand for us, advocates, right? And they stand the entire case and interact, and they'll take a little break and sit down. But when you're being tried, you stand. That's the image here. So when your verdict is read, what do? If you've ever been in a court case, what do? If you've ever watched a court show, the defendant stands, right? The defendant stands to hear the verdict. Jesus here says, listen, I might be standing now, but there is going to be a day where I'm going to be seated, and it's going to be at the place of prominence, which is the right hand of power. In other words, the right hand of power was a place of prominence as they viewed it, and it was a place of position to be able to judge. Now notice what he says next. You will see the Son of Man. I'll be seated at the right hand of power, and I'll be coming on the clouds of heaven. He says, listen, I came at the announcement of angels, but there will be a day where I will come in the clouds. You think you're getting away with this. I want you to know that I'm in absolute total control. And that I am the judge who will come and judge the earth. I am the one who will answer and demonstrate exactly who I am. This is not going to escape you. This is actually going to take place. So here we are, Jesus, who is absolutely guilty of being the Messiah, guilty of being the King. Yet his guilt was necessary so that our guilt could be taken. His guilt was absolutely necessary. Now, I want to pause here and I want to wrap this into our lives for a moment. Don't miss this point this morning. Don't miss this. Because if I'm being honest, I think we're fascinated with being our own rulers, our own judge. Like I have a hard time thinking about somebody sitting on the bench judging me. I remember once I got a ticket, more than once, but it happened once that I did this. And it's one of my weaknesses is my foot gets a little heavy. And I think I belong in NASCAR sometimes. And I got a ticket, and so I decided, because I never tried it before, that I was going to go and fight it. And just plead, basically, guilty with explanation. And my point was going to be that, I came over a hill, and, I had the radio on, and I was just saying, I was calling myself guilty, but with explanation, hopefully that they would take the points away. And, it wasn't that fast or anything, but it was enough that the cop got me speeding, but I was hoping they'd show a little more sug on there. And, you go in this courtroom, and they have it all bright, and all the lights are on you, and, I don't mind standing before people, but there was something about it when the judge walked in, and he's in total control. You know what I mean? He's got his glasses on, he's sitting there, and then he calls up the number, and I go up there, and I'm like, yeah, I'm guilty, and then I give an explanation, and he says, do you realize? And I'm just thinking, all right, man, we're going to, you pay the fine, and we take the points off, no big deal. And I wasn't really worried, like I don't get tickets all the time, so I wasn't really worried about it, but I thought I'd just get out of the points at least, right? Because somebody told me that before, hey, you should always fight a ticket because you get out of the points. Well, I did that, and here's what the judge said to me. He said, don't you realize this is only worth 1 point? What are you doing here? I was like, well, sir, I'd like to have those, points revoked if there's any way, so I figured I'd ask. And, I had this interaction. He goes, well, let it be known that if you get a ticket within this amount of time, you are not going to get away with it again. And I'm sitting there like in turmoil over why did I ever listen to somebody who said to always battle your points? I should just pay the fine, take the point, and not pin him. He literally, I'm sitting there, I don't know if you've ever been in those courts. Some of those people can't speak a sentence, and I'm in there eloquently sharing my story. Like I'm preaching to him. And he takes and looks at me over those glasses, and almost like, and I don't know if it was God making a point to me, because you know what I mean? Like God was speaking through him. Dave, you think you're in control. You're not in control, right? It's intimidating. Jesus here is saying, listen, on earth, every single person is looking in the courtroom. Every person here this morning is making a decision as to whether you say Jesus is who he claimed to be. Is he God? Is he the Christ? Is he King? Now, if you're here this morning and you don't know Christ, your life is a courtroom. What do you see him to be? Is he a liar? Is he a fraud? Is he as they saw him, a blasphemer or claimed to be something crazy? You're here this morning and maybe you know Christ. Your life is a courtroom. How are you living before the judge? I think Jesus brings this back to them and says, listen, I want you to know I've got the final word in this. I will be seated at the right hand of power, and I'm going to come again in the clouds. And Jesus is saying, now make your decision based upon that. And for you and I this morning, we have to make our decision based upon the reality of that truth, that we know who Jesus is. And the question is, are we living our life as if he is who he claimed to be? Are we living our life? Because this question, this idea of judgment, right? We are fascinated by this idea. We put God on trial every single day of our lives. We put God on trial and we say, God, are you going to be who you are in my life? Are you going to have your way? Are you going to have the verdict of my life is going to be you? And that you justified me. You made me who I am. We all have God on trial. What is the verdict of your life? How are you living from? I love what John 3 says in verse 18. It says, whoever believes in him is not condemned. But whoever does not believe is condemned already because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. Your life is a courtroom. How do you view Jesus? The Son of God, Son of Man, Jesus Christ, the God, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Or is your verdict, no, he's a part of my life, He didn't have it all. I think Jesus here reminds us, no, I'm in control. Do you not realize in the end, I get the final word? I get the final word. Let's stand together as we pray this morning.